folks, Ariel over here, not in Fineth. This is probably my final anniversary video related to a tiny house because Thanksgiving Day 10 years ago was the first night I slept in my tiny house, and I've kind of almost every year I think since done an anniversary video. And I had mentioned in last year's that it was probably the last one we'd be living in the tiny house, and we are not. I'm actually standing in our newly almost finished kitchen in our temporary shop apartment, which I'll have a video on that. I'm really excited. I think it looks great. But anyway, it's a frosty morning outside. It was about 4 below 0 Fahrenheit when I woke up, and just thought I'd do what I've done for a bunch of years now and kind of share my thoughts on everything about, after having lived in a tiny house for most of 10 years and now having moved into a different structure, what do I think of it? If you're new here, welcome. Probably some of this doesn't interest you at all. If you want to see all the stuff about all the years I did live in the tiny house, I don't even know how many videos are on the channel, 800 or 900 or something, a lot of which deal with those years. Anyway, if you've been around from the beginning, then this may be of interest to you. And I know there are still people watching, which is crazy to me, that remember some of the very, very, very first things I ever shared about life in the tiny house in the clearing. Thanks for being here all those years with me. Anyway, in summary, do I regret having lived in a tiny house where I'm not living in one now? Absolutely not. I think purchasing Fineth was still probably the best financial decision I've ever made in my life, and I've talked about this multiple times over the years. Depending on your particular situation and what other housing options are available to you, that does not necessarily mean it would be the best financial choice for you. But in my situation, it absolutely was. It got me out of renting, which was getting crazy expensive and has only gotten exponentially more so in those intervening years, and allowed me to stay in an area where I loved, like the mountains of Wyoming, and not live in a van, which was the other thing I was considering, which would have been pretty tough to do straight through the cold winters. Anyway, I think what I thought in the first place, because I didn't have a dream of, for many years, I want to live in a tiny house. I didn't even know they existed until a few weeks before I purchased mine. But what I was looking at was they were a option. And the more options you have in life in general, probably, but I'm specifically going to be talking about housing, the better you are able to find one that fits well your particular situation. There are lots of kinds of options. You could have a giant mansion. You could live in a dorm room. You could stay in a hostel. You could stay in a motel room. You could rent an apartment. You could live in a townhome. You can have roommates. You can live by yourself. There's just a ton of options. I have done one of a lot of those at some point in my life. I grew up with a lot of people in a fairly big single family home with, my parents and younger siblings. When I first moved out, I lived in a little studio apartment on top of somebody's detached garage. Then I had a roommate for many years, and she and I lived in quite a few different houses, apartments, condos, townhomes, varying nicenesses and expensivenesses. And then I lived in a tiny house. Now I'm living in the corner of a shop, and we are right over there outside under the snow working on building a little house, which is where I'm hoping to spend the rest of my life. But my point is that different options work well at different times and in different situations in life. And absolutely, I think in my situation, having the tiny house was one of the best things ever. All of these options also come with pros and cons. Could Clay and I both have squeezed into the tiny house and lived there forever? We probably could have. I know there are couples and even families who live in spaces of, 150, 60 square feet, but it would certainly have been snug. And with our very cold climate, that does make it a little extra challenging, because there are some things where you actually have to all have a pair of boots, and probably 2 pairs of boots, because if you get one either wet or sweaty, you need to be able to change footwear. You probably need a couple coats and so on, and heavy winter stuff gets bulky and takes space, and it would have definitely been crowded for the two of us together, because it fit me and my stuff almost perfectly, but without really any room left to add another person. But I've fit my life into different places, and they all had different pros and cons, and that's kind of something that's just generally true in much of life, but definitely with housing. So with some of the apartments and condos I lived in, things just functioned more automatically. I mean, there was heating on thermostats, hot running water without having to carry it, etc. That was nice. I was working a lot at a lot of different jobs. I was gone a lot, but we did have a little more space, even with a roommate. At one point we had a spare bedroom. At one point we had a kind of spare loft corner. We always had couches and a futon, and we hosted a lot of guests. They used to host couch surfers. If you were ever familiar with couchsurfing.com, we hosted hundreds of different people from around the world. It was fascinating. It was fun. I enjoyed that. And when I moved into the tiny house, I quit hosting couch surfers. I just really didn't have space to have a lot of random strangers from all over. There was enough space that, friends and family who came over could stay there if they didn't mind being pretty tight, but it was a little tighter than I was comfortable living with total strangers from anywhere. Anyway, so each place has come with its pros and cons. That was something I really enjoyed doing. I met a lot of fascinating people from all over the planet, being able to host people visiting Wyoming. And I kind of miss doing that. But the tiny house came with its own pros. Like, I love the years in the clearing, getting to see all of the wildlife outside the windows, having grizzly bears, mountain lions, moose, all that kind of thing outside the windows on a regular basis. That was fun. I kind of miss that now some of the time because that was neat. But right now, I'm so glad that we can have chickens and ducks and a garden and an orchard and do things that I could not, I couldn't keep chickens and ducks with grizzly bears and mountain lions walking through the yard on a regular basis. So each situation comes with things that I love about it. There's some things that, worked in a different situation that don't now, etc. But I guess I still feel the same as I did when I moved into the tiny house. It is awesome to have as many options as you can, because then you can find the one that works really well for you and your situation, your particular needs, and those will probably change throughout your life. I had people who were very concerned when I moved into the tiny house. What are you going to do when you get really, really old? You may not be able to crawl up that loft ladder stairs thing. That was probably true. I'm not very, very old yet, but I'm sure at some point that will happen. But I think some people have an idea that maybe a tiny house is like an end life goal rather than I think of any house or dwelling as like a box that you live your life out of. It's really nice to have a clean, dry, out of the weather box for sure. And I have lived in some that weren't quite that. One apartment we lived in for a while had water dripped off the main beam in the middle of the house every time the sun shone, and there was green mold coming through the walls. That's not ideal, but even there we were able to make a comfortable home, and I think the only reason we didn't get really sick probably was because it was so wet that the mold was never dry. But I was able to make a cozy home in there. We had guests come over who never even noticed. They said, "Oh, this is such a cozy house." And I thought, well, I think it's actually rotting down about our ears, but nobody noticed that. And so I think of whatever box you're living in, we're kind of living in pretty much a box here in the shop right now, as a place where I could be warm and dry and keep clothing, food, etc. out of the weather and live my life from. And that can be done from a lot of different places. I'm pretty good if you give me a shed, a shop, just any kind of a dry box out of the weather, I could probably make it fairly comfortable and home-like. And I think that's the real point. So I'm, I guess, fairly comfortable picking up my little nest and re-nesting into a new box of whatever kind in whatever spot. And I think that's a useful skill because, like I said, each one of them comes with a whole host of pros and cons. So do I not live in a tiny house now because they're a bad idea and I regret it? Absolutely not. I think it was absolutely the best situation I could have had for quite a few years. It fit one person really well. It allowed me to stay in a particular spot. Even allowed me to meet Clay. That was not anything that was planned as part of it, but that is what happened. And now, do I regret not living in it because it was great? No, I don't really. There are aspects of each of these different places I've lived and different things I've done in life that were a lot of fun that, I kind of miss. but I'm also doing things now that I couldn't do then, that I wished I could have done then, but I couldn't. So there's just always these trade-offs. You can't ever have everything in life because there's, at the same time, because there's only so many hours in a day, and you can't do everything. So I just feel really content and really thankful. Really like our cozy little space here in the end of the shop. Look forward to moving the vast majority of everything in here into our cozy little house once it's more than a foundation next year. May not be moving in there till the year after, but at least it should look like more than a foundation at some point next year, hopefully. And that's really my thoughts after a decade of living in a tiny house and even off-grid, if you're wondering about that. So the tiny house still is off-grid, and if you're wondering what she's doing, she's still sitting right down by the snow-covered garden. I think we got some friends staying in her overnight tomorrow. We've had various friends and family members use it as their guest house when they come visit us, which is nice because this little corner shop apartment does not have a spare bedroom or anything. It doesn't even have a full-size couch in it, so if you're short, you could curl up on the couch and go to sleep and be comfortable, but it's not the most comfortable place to have somebody else sleep. So find Eth as being a great guest house, and have no plans at the moment for her to go anywhere. But it's, just different circumstances make different things work better, and I think being flexible with that and looking at the whole host of options you have and trying to think out what is the best one for your situation, your finances. Do you live in a place where the average rent runs $3,000 plus per bedroom to have roommates? Then a fairly expensive tiny house, which is what I got, could make a ton of sense. Compared to having continued to rent for the years I lived in her, I've talked about this before because it was true years and years ago, but that tiny house has paid for itself many times over, even if I burned it to the ground today. Depending where else you live, though, if you live in rural Missouri and you can buy a farmhouse on 5 acres for half of what I spent for a tiny house, well, then buying one would probably be a little dumb. That would not be a good financial investment, because having a house on wheels comes with some extra expenses. You gotta have wheels and axles and a trailer frame that can handle the weight of having a small house on top of it, and some things you don't normally have to do if you build a house attached to the ground. And so that does add extra expense, but it worked out really well for me, because even though I lived in one spot almost all the time, we were able to move the house onto this property when we first moved down here. And then for a while, I was basically still living it, and Clay was living at his job, and we were back and forth. But if he was home for a night or a weekend or anything, we had a warm, dry place to stay, hang out, cook meals, do all that kind of thing, while we got other things constructed on this blank slate piece of property. So that's all just worked out really well. So what do I think about tiny houses after almost 10 years of living in one and not now? I think they're an awesome option. I don't regret anything about it. And if you're in a situation where that makes sense for you, I highly recommend doing it. As far as off-grid, I enjoyed being fully off-grid in the tiny house. She still is. We are not fully off-grid in the shop. We have wiring into here. This was very important to both Clay and I, every essential to life thing in our climate: heating, cooking, toileting, bathing, water, food, all of those things we wanted to for sure be able to do without electricity. And we have that. The wood stove is crackling away. The camera might be picking it up a little bit right behind you. We are still using a composting toilet. That's our plan to do forever. We have gravity-fed spring water, and we just have to fill a tank. Pretty much exactly like what I did in the tiny house, except it's bigger, so you have to fill it less often. We do use our electric lighting. It's fairly convenient, but if that went away, we have all the candles, lamps, lanterns, headlights, flashlights, all those kinds of things. So we are enjoying a few electrical luxuries in here without tying into a solar system. And I've done very detailed stuff on my little solar system at the tiny house, which is still running. I'm pretty much past the expected life expectancy on all components of it at this point. And that technology has gone so far and away above what it was when I moved in there that if you were building something today, you would never build it, out of the same kinds of pieces and components that I did then. But it's still running, it still works. However, had I had the option to connect to grid power, which I did not up there in the clearing, but had I had that option, it still would have, in the last decade, I would have spent less paying for the very minimal amount of electricity I use if I had bought it from the grid than I did spend on the solar system. Now, it's great for independence, it's great for flexibility and being able to live in a location where there is no grid power available. There are all kinds of pros to it, but is it really environmentally friendly or financially makes sense? Again, if you live in a spot that has super high electrical rates, possibly, but in a lot of places, not yet. Maybe the technology will get there at some point. But anyway, I've done both and I'm fine with both. For sure, though, key to me is having the option to do things that you can't live without: heating, bathrooming, eating, cooking, those kind of water, without electricity, period, whether the electricity is coming from a solar system or the grid power or whatever. And that is our setup here and our continued plan, because I do think that is important, because components in your own little solar system can break. The grid can go down because you get a blizzard, or if you live somewhere other than us, you could get a hurricane, etc. So I think it's always wise to be prepared to do life essential things without any power at all. Even if you have backup generators and backup solar and stuff, the more backups, of course, in anything in life, the less likely you are to end up in a really bad situation. But anyway, I probably still have preference to live that way. If it was just up to me, we probably wouldn't be putting any wiring at all in our little house we're building. I'd just keep my fridge and freezer over here in the shop. Clay would rather have it there, so we're going to, because we make compromises with each other and he compromises on other things to do them the way I want. But I'm really fine with living either of those ways. Like I said, I'm fine with living in whatever box. And isn't this a cool looking box? Now we got the upper kitchen cabinets hung up, and I'll have to do a kitchen tour in a different video. Anyway, so that's my thoughts. If that's helpful at all, if you're considering moving into a tiny house now, I know in the past decade, there's become exponentially more information on them, people's experiences living in them, as there have been many, many more people who have done it, and so on. I still think they're an awesome option in the right situation and at the right time. Would I ever move back into one? Yeah, if the right situation came up, absolutely. I have great, great memories of my time in there. Do I miss it? Not really, because I love the things I'm doing now too. And I look forward to moving into our little home that's not a tiny house together. And I'm hoping to spend the rest of my life there, but you never know what'll come up in life. So that's my thoughts after not quite a decade of life in a tiny house, on the anniversary of the first snowy winter day when I moved in and spent a night alone in my little, not entirely warm because I didn't have the wood stove in there yet. And that will tell you, if you have some questions about how some of this stuff works, I'd still go back and watch some of my old videos. A forced air little propane heater is not entirely adequate to keep you comfortable in a Wyoming winter. Now, most of the globe is not as cold as we are, so it probably will work in most places, but it certainly kept me from dying. But there's a reason that a year later I had a little wood stove in there and used that the rest of the time. But anyway, the anniversary of that night, which was exciting and a little overwhelming and a little scary, and that's my thoughts 10 years later. So hopefully that's just helpful. Nobody else's life is exactly the same as mine, but hopefully my experiences can sometimes benefit someone else who's trying to make their own decisions and think through what works best for them. And I wish you all a wonderful winter, whatever that's like for you.
Thank you everyone for watching. It means a lot, and I hope you learned something along the way.
If you know somebody else who would enjoy this as well, share it with them.